Hello folks, here we are on a rainy afternoon in Toronto. It's been pouring all day and it sort of feels more indoorsy, I guess, although there's wonderful things to show you outside. I don't think the cameras will be out in the pouring rain today. So we're going to stick around indoors and we're going to talk about growing and propagating fruit trees and shrubs, and maybe a little bit about nuts. Most of the fruits that we get commercially now, and even most of the ones that people grow in their home gardens, are varieties that have been hybridized or selected from ones that occurred naturally, and then they were cloned and cloned and cloned repeatedly. When I was a little kid, the only grapes I knew were those blue, very round, very sweet grapes that where the insides kind of pop out of the skins, and they're full of seeds. And that's what I thought grapes were like. And then suddenly we discovered that they had seedless grapes. And then there was seedless oranges and seedless watermelons and all kinds of things that used to have seeds, like bananas, are now so often produced by clones that they very seldom produce seeds anymore, probably because the thing that used to pollinate them doesn't do so anymore. Maybe they're grown in an area with no pollinators, but then other things have been done to them to make them not produce seeds as well. One of them I'm still learning about, gibberellic acid. I'm not sure about that. I have to look up more about that. But if you grow things from seed, you will not be sure exactly what the plant will be like, whether it will be like its mother or its father, and you may not ever know who its father is. So it's a bit of a scramble, but it also maintains the biodiversity in the species and in the human food supply. So if you want to grow things from seed in temperate climates, you have to learn about stratifying the different kinds of seeds. Apple seeds, plum pits, cherry pits, different kinds of nuts. This isn't so hard to do. It's just the only thing you have to remember is what climate those plants came from originally. And if they are local to a temperate climate like we have here, then you just have to calculate the approximate number of weeks of real winter that we have here, and that's the number of weeks that your seeds need to be kept cold. But you may not want to have them outside, because for some kinds of seeds, freezing isn't such a great idea. You want to keep them just above freezing. So what we do is we take a little jar like this, or you can use a little plastic baggie. And what I have here is some blackberries, but I've got some little apple seeds somewhere too. Some larch seeds, which I think would need stratifying too. Now this year the blackberries were very strange, and some of the raspberries as well. It was so dry out that they didn't rot. They just dried out right on the plant if I didn't get to pick them. And they do have these tiny little seeds here. And these seeds, usually if they're eaten by a bird or some other animal, the acids in the stomach will help to give the seed the oomph it needs to get it to germinate. So if it passes through a bird's stomach undamaged or only slightly damaged, then the bird will poo it out some distance away from where it was eaten, because some of the seeds will get ground up in the bird's crop, but some of them come through pretty unscathed. And that's how these plants spread themselves. That's why they grow a lovely succulent fruit. Excuse me. So we're going to put this in the fridge with some damp sand. You could just even use a damp paper towel and put a lid on it. And because these are blackberries and blackberries are native to a place where you get quite a bit of winter, I would say give them at least 90 days in the fridge.
So we will put some sand or towel into the glass?
Just to keep a moist atmosphere in there.
So inside the glass with some sand or towel?
Yep. You can use some other medium as well if you have vermiculite or if you have cocoa fiber or something like that. But you don't want to lose sight of where the seeds are, and sometimes after seeds are in the fridge like that, being stratified for the period of time they require, they will actually start to germinate in the jar. And if you take the jar out and look at it every couple of weeks, you'll see little signs of germination. And those seeds are then viable and ready to go into a planter box or a flat, or right into the garden if you like.
Is the purpose of the sand or fabric is kind of mimic the soil?
Well, yeah, but it's mostly to be a source. Like, you don't want the seed to be soggy. It's not supposed to sit in water, but you want there to be atmospheric moisture. So the main purpose of the sand or the paper is just to maintain some atmospheric moisture in the jar, so that it'll be like it was outdoors during a mild winter.
So not too wet, not too dry.
Right, just
like the soil.
Yeah, because if it was outdoors, there would be rain, there would be snow, and it's supposed to be cold and damp, but not right in water. Now, mind you, there's some kinds of plants that do want to have the seeds right in water, but our usual fruit tree type and berry bush type plants don't want to be that wet.
The purpose of put the jar with the seed into the refrigerator is to kind of mimic a winter.
Exactly.
For the seed. So they think they go through the winter, and when the jar take out of the fridge, they think the spring is coming.
Exactly. And because we're actually doing this over the winter anyway, that we're not fooling the plant very much. We're mostly just giving it a fairly controlled environment so that it won't be too extreme. Because sometimes if things are outside, all of a sudden it can warm up and they can germinate, which is great if it stays warm. But then suddenly you can have another killer frost right after things germinate. And sometimes when things are just at that very delicate early stage, it's a bit much, although I suspect blackberries could take it.
So the jar will not put into the freeze compartment, into the lower compartment?
Just the lower compartment is fine, yeah. There are some things that maybe should go into the freezer compartment, but that's more for long-term storage. And then you don't want to have that much moisture in there. Some things, though, the seed coat is so hard that the freezing and thawing might actually break the seed coat, which might be necessary. I'm just going to show you this other lovely berry here. This looks a bit like a blackberry, but it's a toxic berry. This is a poison berry. See these beautiful blackberries? They are not blackberries, they are blackberries. And they have this lovely round appearance. Now these are pokeberries. And the pokeberry bush actually starts out just a green shoot comes up in the very early spring. And in the old days, this was the first vegetable that people would look forward to. You had to boil it in 3 changes of water, and you could only eat it until it was about 6 inches long, and then you had to stop eating it because it got too poisonous. Well, we've got so many other greens, I can't be bothered with that now. But this is a plant with medicinal uses, and it's also a very beautiful native plant. So we grow it, and the birds will eat the seeds and spread them around that way. Anyway, it's a beautiful plant.
What's the name of this plant?
The poke plant.
Poke plant.
Yeah, the poke berries, poke shoots. There must be some fancier Latin name for it, but I don't know that.
Be careful, folks. Don't come close to that plant. It's toxic.
It is toxic. Well, you can come close, but you don't want to eat it, and you don't want your little kids to get it. So anyway, we're going to work on different kinds of berries that are edible because we want that more. Growing outside, we've got beautiful fall-bearing raspberries. Excuse me. And I'm going to try to get a few of those to grow from seed as well because I'd like to see if those offspring will also be fall-bearing. One would hope so, because I don't have any fall-bearing ones in my garden. Mine are all done by the end of July. And so, but the approach will be the same. We'll put them in the fridge for 3 to 4 months, and then we'll plant them in the spring. I have these larch cones here. Everybody know what the larch is. It's not a food tree to the best of my knowledge, but it is a beautiful native tree, and it's a conifer, but it's deciduous, which is kind of ironic because most conifers are supposed to be evergreen, and the larch loses its needles, which are very soft needles. They're not prickly at all, and so I often have the problem when I'm first trying to identify what part of something is the seed. So you're picking apart the cone and looking for the seed, and because cones are scales. This is a kind of a scale, an adapted scale, and this is the female flower. Conifers also have male flowers that rain pollen down on the female flowers. These are very old trees, of course. The conifer family goes back to dinosaur days. But when you're looking at the seed, sometimes you can tell that something is a seed because it's just got a more regular shape. So I'm going to gamble on the fact that this is a seed. And so we're going to try to stratify a few of those too. And because this tree is happy in Toronto, I guess it needs about 3 to 4 months of stratification as well. And the other kinds of things that need to be stratified are of course things like nuts, and they require soaking in water for 3 or 4 days and then stratifying. Some people keep them at regular sort of room temperature for the first couple of months, and then they soak them, and then they stratify them. Some people...
that is soak them in water and then put into the fridge.
Yeah. Yeah, in some kind of a... You want to have... They shouldn't be airtight. They should have some kind of a... circulation around them, because otherwise they can get moldy and rotten. But at the same time, again, you want to keep them with a slightly moist atmosphere so that they don't dry out while they're in the fridge. And if nuts are outside, of course, they have a lot of help in germinating because, first of all, there's squirrels. And squirrels, of course, do the majority, or through recent history anyway, until humans got involved, they were doing the majority of the tree planting, squirrels and similar animals. And they usually bite a little hole in a nut, and that allows the nut to absorb some moisture from the soil after the squirrel buries it, and it also makes it a little easier for the nut to germinate. So some people, when they're working with nuts, will scarify the shell. You can use a file or something to file a little opening into it without actually cracking it, so that it still has a protection, but it does have a little breathing room to start the germination process. Some people scarify other kinds of seeds as well, things like peach pits, apricot pits, plum pits. And you can, it's usually not necessary with those, but it may speed things up for some of them. I wouldn't bother doing that with cherries. Cherries germinate very easily after being stratified. And you will get a huge variety of results from doing this. You may wonder how long it takes until you actually get edible results. Well, with berries, you usually can take a crop off. By the third year, you've got a proper crop. But with apples, pears, plums, things like that, it's between 6 and 8 years before it starts to bear if you plant from seed. And commercial interests don't usually want to wait that long to see what the fruit from any particular bush is going to taste like. And this is, I suppose, understandable, but it's kind of unfortunate because you have to realize that when you've got a variety of fruit, it is really one individual that is cloned and cloned and cloned. And, you know, they say there's only one Macintosh apple tree, and they're not self-fertile. So the more seed-borne plants there are around, the more biodiverse our food supply will be. And we're not all trying to grow commercial crops. Sometimes we just want to have a nice tree. And so it's always a good idea to have two individuals that are really genetically distinct individuals that can cross with each other. And this goes for even plants like cherries that are fairly self-fertile. It's good for them to have a buddy, you know, like they should be part of a community of their own kind, because trees do tend to grow in communities. It's very unusual for them to grow all by themselves. And as we learn more about how plants communicate with each other through chemicals, exuded through the root systems, maybe they really need a little bit of that.
Some people also stress the importance of the diversity of the gene pool.
Yes. Oh.
Can you mention a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, you know, it's like with people. If we were all cloned, then we would have the same disease resistance, the same talents and abilities, or lack thereof. And we would have, I guess we'd all sort of look similar. And with the trees and the commercially grown food plants, uniformity is something that they keep striving for, because it makes it easier to package things. It makes it easier to know what kind of machine you need to help you pick something, or what kind of a box you need to send it to market in. And so you can sort of understand why they want that uniformity. But actually, for our own personal use, the diversity really works best. You know, your 3-year-old might not be able to finish a whole large apple, but they might certainly be able to make quick work of a little apple, you know, just a sort of a little hand-sized apple. And so we don't really need everything to look like it comes from the store. Just going to mention a little bit about grapes for a minute. Excuse me. Those wild types of grapes and the grapes that have seeds are much more nutritious than the ones that are just lovely, pulpy sweetness. And that's because the seeds themselves have a lot of nutrition in them. Things like watermelons also, that people keep going for seedless ones, but those seeds also have nutrition in them. Melon seeds have all kinds of uses and all kinds of valuable fats, along the lines of pumpkin and squash seeds. And if we make everything seedless, you know, we're sort of turning our entire diet into baby food, and the human jaw has been shrinking over the last 50,000 years until now we really can't chew most of the things our ancestors used to be able to eat. They had to eat tough meat and raw nuts and hard fruits and vegetables and roots. And I guess as they learned to cook things and make things a little easier to eat, they got a bit spoiled, and we're a bit spoiled. So now we have these eeny-weeny jaws, and we have to get our wisdom teeth pulled, and some people don't even have a big enough jaw for some of their other teeth. And this is sort of this is because we stopped eating things that required chewing. And if you have grapes in your garden, you'll see in the dead of winter, if you've left any of those little shriveled grapes on, the little birds will come and they will feed on those grapes. And it's going to be nice for them to get a little energy from that sweet pulp in the shriveled up little raisin of a grape that's left on the vine. But they really need the energy and the heat that they get from the seeds. You can get gourmet cooking done in grapeseed oil now. It's also used for cosmetics, I think. And it's considered an extremely valuable cooking oil. And it seems ironic to me that we want to get rid of it and not make it a daily part of our grape intake. I'm just going to show you a couple of other things that isn't...
In the meantime, if folk like to ask any question, just type in the chat line.
Okay.
We can answer the questions.
Okay. Another kind of plant that needs stratification that we're going to talk about briefly is the native plants, the native North American plants that live in a temperate zone. They need stratification too, if they're perennials, for the most part. Not absolutely everything, but most perennials do. And one thing we have is members of the mint family. And, oh wait, no, we weren't going to go there yet. We're going to talk about some of that first. Where's the bones? I found some bone set seeds. This one, I believe, needs stratifying. It's related to Joe Pye weed. The flowers on Joe Pye weed are pink. These flowers are white. And it's a very unusual plant in that it has the stem growing through the leaf, apparently. And it used to be believed it was good to cure broken bones. I don't know if it is or not, because I haven't used it for that, but I will tell you that bees will love this plant, and it's very beautiful and quite unusual. There's not too much of it around. It likes to have its feet a bit wet, so if you have a sunny patch in your garden where there's a downspout, or you tend to get a bit of a flooded area, it might be happier there. And as you can see, the seeds are tiny, tiny little black seeds with a little white tuft on them. Looks a lot sort of like lettuce seeds, but it's also an airborne kind of seed, and you should germinate those also in a little container in the fridge for about 3 to 4 months.
So also put into the glass jar and put some sand or fabric.
Yeah, or a moist paper towel or whichever. It's good enough. Sometimes the moist paper towel is easier. So anyway, I highly recommend this plant just because I think you'll think it's really beautiful. And you'll make a lot of
when
these.
This time we germinate, you should put it in the container pot or...
Well, you probably won't get it germinating in the fridge. After it's germinated, actually with native plants, I find the easiest way to stratify them is just to put them in pots and put the pot outside. Because these are native plants, right? Some of the fruits come from slightly more tender climates than we have here. Things like apricots, they're more Mediterranean. But these guys, I'm pretty confident that they're pretty happy just being outside. But it's always a good idea if you're germinating outside to put a screen over your bed or over your flat, because you will get a zillion little birds and squirrels trying to dig up seeds. Once they know there's native plant seeds there, they may go for them because they're hard to find in some places. And it's always good to protect them so they can get to the point where they can help with the wildlife. Excuse me.
Can you, if you don't mind, can you describe more detail about how to put the native plant outside for the winter?
Oh, okay. Well, if you just have
I mean the native seed, sorry.
the native seeds outside. If you just have a flower pot or a flat that you can, just like it can be like one of those plant flats you get from a plant nursery. They throw them out by the hundreds every year, so I usually pick up a few of the better kind, and then you can just put some pots in there, or you can just make a flat out of like an old flat container. People throw out styrofoam containers all the time. They throw out wooden grape boxes, so you can use anything like that and just fill it with a fairly light mix, and then just put a screen over it and leave it to the weather, and with the seeds included, but don't put them in too deep. Just cover them lightly. You can see a seed like this is so small, like the bone set seeds. You don't need to cover it very much. But
how thick should be the covering?
Well, usually you don't cover a seed more than a couple of times the thickness of the actual seed, 2 to 3 times its
that
own
would be
height.
very, very thin.
Yeah.
If the seed is tiny.
Yeah, so if it's a bean, you can put that bean a couple of inches in the ground and it'll be just fine finding its way up because it's a big seed. But tiny little seeds, they don't really want to struggle so much. They don't have that much energy in them. The energy of a seed is partly in the size of the seed. So the faster it can get to light, the faster it can start making carbohydrate through photosynthesis. And the faster it can get going. So if they're too long in the dark, they will run out of their own food before they reach the light and start making their own food. This is slightly off topic. This is totally off topic, but I wanted to show you people, because I've been collecting seeds from herbs, and some of them are perennial, but a lot of them are just regular garden herbs. This is a bit of lavender, and I've got the no-brainer here. No-brainer is catnip, and of course if you can find some catnip growing, the trick is just to keep your cat away from it long enough for it to get growing. But I wanted to show you how to find the seeds in a mess like this. So this is a bit of lavender. And if we're lucky, if we squeeze this lavender likes a cool germination too. It doesn't really need a long stratification, but it should be planted early in the year, around February. And so it can get some winter, but not a really bad winter, because it's a Mediterranean plant. So it likes to, there's some seeds falling out of there. They're really tiny little seeds. But as you can see, a lot of these plants have little tubes. The flowers are like little tubes. You can see there's a little hole, and sometimes I can make the seed fall out, but it's a little hard to get it to come out sometimes. And with the catnip, which I think has more seeds in it because it's more recent, there are many little black seeds, and each tube has some seeds in it. By the way, if you like to grow catnip, you have to find an old bird cage in the garbage and put it over your catnip plant, because if you don't cover the part of the plant that's growing, the cats will eat it right down to the roots of the soil it's growing in. But you can see these little tubes are full of seeds, and it can be a pain to get them out. But once the plant is really dry, you can usually just shake it and get a lot of the seeds out that way. If you want to, you can then, of course, give the rest of it to your cat to have fun with.
What's the name of this plant?
This is catnip. Take a snip.
And this one?
Well, that's lavender. That's just little lavender flowers. Right,
so that's the
seeds.
Flower.
Well, yes.
Inside the flower is the seed.
Yeah. Well, yes. Inside what's left of the flower on the stem is the seed, and with the catnip, it's the same thing. The catnip and many of the things like lemon balm, a lot of these things are in the mint family. and when they're in the, you can see they have a squarish stem. The catnip has a square stem, so it's in the mint family. See, it's square. 4 sides to that stem. And so many of those plants have that kind of seed pod, which is what's left of the flower. So it just makes it a little easier, so you know where to find the seeds when you're actually looking for them, because if you just look at this seed, say, where the heck are the seeds? You have to see them fall out.
Do we need to stratify this these two type of seed?
Not the catnip.
For the lavender?
Well, lavender, a little bit stratified. Start it cold, but it's not quite the same as having to put it in the fridge. I guess it's a form of stratification. I didn't really think of it that way, but they always say start your lavender, like February, March, and then let it gradually get used to because if you start it in a warm greenhouse, it doesn't do as well as if you expose it to some cold early on, in my experience.
So it means put the lavender seed outside in February or March?
Well, after the worst of the winter is over. It can take some winter at that stage, but because it's a Mediterranean plant, it wants Mediterranean winter.
Okay, so it means start to put them in soil in February or March.
Yeah. Yeah, and they'll grow very slowly from seed. Of course, lavender is another plant that almost everybody grows from a cutting, right? So I'm being the heretic and saying, grow it from seed, just for variety of life.
Now, lavender, you can put under your pillow if you have trouble sleeping.
You sure can. You can put it under your pillow. You can put it in with your clothes. I heard a talk on the radio the other day. They were talking about how they were going to make their clothes smell nice so that people would know that the clothes were clean, and they don't want any parabens and they don't want any phony chemicals. Well, for hundreds of years, if not more, that's what people do.
You take a little sachet.
Yeah,
and you put it under the pillowcase.
Yep, or put it in with your laundry.
It helps you sleep.
Yeah, you put it in with your clean laundry too, in a drawer or something,
right.
And then it makes your clothes smell very nice.
Change the subject a little bit. Black-eyed Susan.
Black-eyed Susan.
You can take it from seed, yeah.
And just drop the seed any old where, and if it's a sunny place, it will grow pretty much without any help.
No, because we had some back there, and they've all gone to that stage where you can grab the seed.
Well, if you
and a lady wants to.
If you just pick off the heads, I don't have any of the heads here with me today, but if you pick off the heads and just shake them when they're dry, or rub them a little bit, many little black seeds will fall off.
Put a little bag, a mesh, like a cheesecloth, around it.
Well, it's not.
Tie it off, and then all the seeds will stay in the.
Yeah, I think with Black-eyed Susan, it's not that hard. You don't have to bother doing that with them, because the seeds are so abundant, and they do tend to stay on the sort of flower center cone part until you handle them. Usually, they'll fall off eventually, or birds will eat them if you don't fall off.
Well, you got me when you talked about it last time. You got me kind of thinking of all this.
I know, it's fun. It's a bottomless pit. Like once you get into it, because each kind of plant is a little individual, so we can have fun learning more about different things. I just want to see what else I brought here, so I can. Yeah, this was Joe Pye. That's very much like the bone set. Golden Alexanders. Oh no, that's just more lavender. Sorry. To find out what else I've got here. Oh, I think we'll take out the Golden Alexander seed anyway. This is a relative of carrots, and it's very hard to collect their seeds because the seeds will stay green and you can't collect the seeds for the longest time, and then all of a sudden they all start to fall off, and within a few days they're all gone. so it's very annoying. But anyway, I did get some seeds this time. This is a beautiful native plant with yellow flowers that look like little carrot flowers. It's very beautiful. And I highly recommend that we'll plant some of those out there somewhere.
I guarantee you can find lots of places. It's like my garden spot is. You can plant anything you want there. I ripped it out.
Okay.
I got so frustrated.
We'll keep that in mind.
But there's a nice little. I'm going to turn it over, and I'm overhauling the composter. When I lifted them, there was about that much compost in the bottom. So I got it in a wheelbarrow. I'm going to dump it in the soil, and then I'll turn it over. And
that's the best thing that you can feed a garden is the compost.
Yeah. Oh, this has got to have been there for 5 years. It's so fine, it doesn't even smell.
Well,
there's no smell to it at all.
Once it's been through worms, I think it wouldn't smell too bad anyway. That worm compost is always really good. If you have any worms here,
I want to find.
You can add a handful of worms.
Little red worms.
Yep.
I want to find out where I can buy them.
Oh, you know where you should
go. And I will dump.
You know where you should go for a donation of free worms? Is go to Mike and Evan at Food Share.
Where?
Food Share on Brock Avenue, just south of Bloor.
Duckman
Yeah.
Queen?
Yeah, they can. If you ask him nicely, he'll give you a handful of worms.
Because I would like to introduce them here.
I know.
Especially for the composting.
You need them.
You throw them in. They help immensely.
They're very quick.
Yeah.
You just got to keep them sort of warm over the winter unless it's a big enough compost.
Well, it's 3 by 3.
Yeah, they should be in the middle. They're probably okay.
3 by 3. It should be, if we can get it going quick enough, the heat should keep it through the winter.
I bring mine in so far for the winter, but I'm sure there's some that get out, and I don't know how they're doing because they're loose.
See, most people have the composters that are plastic.
Yeah.
Right? They will hold it. These ones we have here are chicken wire, wooden frames.
I know. I think the black plastic holds the heat better.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It does, because it actually, there's no way, it just, it impacting, and it heat, right?
I just want to sort of finish what we're talking about here because it's being included in this talk.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. That's the questions we want. We need that.
I'm sorry to
No, stay there. I just want to talk a little bit about growing tropical things from seed. Sometimes you cut open your orange or your grapefruit and you'll find seeds. And sometimes you even find a seed that's already germinated. Avocados, kiwis, all those things. All those.
You put it on toothpicks, semi-submerge it in the water, and the roots come.
And I just want you to remember that seeds in oranges and lemons and things like that are useful in another way too, because if you want to make marmalade, one of the things you include in the boiling mixture is that you include the seeds, because they add pectin to the mixture and then it sets better. So this is something else that, everybody wants seedless oranges, but you're not going to get marmalade out of seedless oranges because, first of all, they're usually too sweet, but also you need that pectin from the seeds and the thick rind. And they're fairly they're not that palatable, the Seville oranges. They're pretty tough eating unless you make them into marmalade. But anyway, all these kinds of things, guavas also you can grow, and you can be producing fruit. I think my guava tree was 3 years old before it started to bear fruit.
Yeah.
But then it was bearing fruit in the greenhouse.
But very, very little.
Well, yes.
You get maybe 3-4.
We'll see we can see how far that can go. Things like figs also. Everybody can have figs. We need figs.
But we can't grow them here.
Well, yes, you can. There's even
if you have a greenhouse.
there's a fig that's hardy in Ontario even without a greenhouse, apparently.
It's like kiwi.
But also,
University of Guelph has come up with a hybrid where there's no
a hardy kiwi.
there's no fuzz on it.
It's like it's a smaller berry. Yeah, it's very nice.
Like they're playing with it, but they haven't they haven't gotten it to the point where.
Anyway, I want to recommend that people do this. That you get seeds from little tropical things, and you see what will grow. You can even grow your own coffee tree. You have to get a green coffee bean. Don't try to germinate a roasted one. And they grow fairly easily, yeah. And they're beautiful plants. I think kumquats grow on little trees you can have in the house. I know people will grow lemons and grapefruits that actually bear fruit indoors. And it gets to be a fairly large tree before it does that. It's sort of like a human-sized tree at least. But you can get fruits from grapefruits and lemons and little oranges.
Because kumquats used to sell you in a little pot.
A lot of the oranges.
Right? You could bring it.
A lot of the oranges are hybrids.
Yes.
So again, you don't know for sure what you're going to get.
Well, if you think about it, every orange on this earth today came from one tree.
Well, there's different species of
probably
every.
It came from one tree.
Maybe every Valencia orange or every Seville orange or something.
Originally, they say that it came from one tree.
I think that if it's the seedless ones, probably he's talking about like those navel oranges. They probably came from one tree.
Like he does every time, interferes.
Clones.
He changes.
Well, they clone and
like
they clone.
Nectarines were what?
Well, nectarines, I think, are a cross between a peach and a plum. But I think, but the thing is, some of these things happen naturally, or else you can sometimes get a plant that you can get a plant that's a sport that will suddenly just have a different characteristic than its ancestors, and then people decide that they're going to save that one because they like it better. One of the things you'll notice is some of those trees that are kind of twisted, like they have a lot of those. Well, like the weeping mulberries and the weeping.
Mulberry, that's a nice fruit.
Well, I know they're wonderful fruits, but the thing is, you don't have to get like the weeping ones are the clones because it's the aberration. They don't tend to be as healthy as the regular kinds of trees. So I think if you're going to grow trees, just grow the regular kinds of trees. And they grow very well from seed. Mulberries, all kinds of berries, and most kinds of fruits.
Pin cherry.
Oh, and those grow those are native ones here, yes, and they should be grown from seed for sure.
You don't. You have to go way up north, go into the bush, and you will find them.
Choke cherries want to build a colony, so you have to have a bit of space because even though choke cherries are not a tall tree, they will.
It's more like a shrub.
Well, yeah, it's about, I don't know, I guess ours got about 8 or 9 feet high, but they were spreading by the roots, so that suddenly you have, it sort of cloned itself, you know, and then you get a colony, yeah. And you have to have room for that, because I think that makes them happier to be able to do that.
How about gooseberries?
Gooseberries, oh, there's another thing I should mention. Gooseberries and currants. Both the red and the white and the black currants are really good for air layering. If you want to have a quick, like you can definitely grow them from seeds with this stratification thing, the way you would with any of these other fruits like raspberries, but you want to, if you want to sort of propagate them quickly, you just take a branch and you lay it down on the ground, and where there is a node, where there's a little stem connecting area,
I know what
a little node, yes, a little node, you put a stone on that.
Oh.
And then you just forget about it for a couple of years. And when you come, well, even just a year, and then when you come back, you will find you have a whole separate little plant that has rooted itself from that node, and you can cut it off, and you have a separate plant. You can dig it up and take it away.
That's something I didn't know.
So you put a stone
Right on the node.
holding the
And walk away.
above the node, holding the branch
So it's in contact with soil.
with the soil,
Yeah.
and just let it grow.
Yep,
Yep.
and it will
Well,
root
it's like
itself very
the
easily.
tomato plants.
They'll do that too, and so will
What happened was
sweet potatoes.
they ignored it along here and along there, and the plant laid down, and they rooted.
You know, this is how plants travel. Like when you first, I think I mentioned to somebody around here that when a tomato falls to the ground and rots in place,
It will
the seeds will germinate in place, and
And
then
it will
they will spread out.
proliferate, yeah.
They will move away from each other, so they each get more space, because they won't get enough nourishment if they all stay in the same place. So this rooting along the stem is how they travel. How they travel from where they started to where they can get a better position.
all these along there, all of them, were this much about a foot,
Yeah,
went to root.
it's plant intelligence. They are getting more nourishment by doing that, and it works. It sometimes makes them a bit more disease susceptible, I guess, if there's a lot of
Right, and it
viruses
picks
in the
up.
soil. But overall, like where they come from, a lot of these things are perennial, even though they're annuals here. But if they can survive from year to year and wander around just by falling down and putting down roots where they end up, it's kind of convenient. And if they run out of nourishment in one place, they can move a few
If you
feet.
let strawberries go wild, they will every year come around
They will.
and like juicy and sweet.
You can't argue with
But now-
strawberries.
I have a question. Sunflower.
Sunflower.
Sunflower is an annual, yes?
It's an annual, yeah.
It doesn't.
Well, there are native sunflowers that are perennial, like the woodland
But the what
sunflower.
we see here, they're all annual.
Well, the big,
You gotta.
the big crop type sunflower with the great big head like that, those are annuals. But a lot of the smaller ones, you have some little wild ones out there, the
Like the
woodland
red one,
sunflowers.
The one over there, the red one. But you have
they're
to
yellow
plant it
flowers.
again. You have to plant, right?
But they will. They travel by bird as well, I think, and by just getting, the seeds get stuck to your shoe or something like that as you're walking, and you may move the seed a little bit. The seeds are very small on the native wild sunflowers. They're not big, striped, oil-rich looking seeds like the ones on the commercial, well, the crop sunflower that was grown for oil seed and food. But they're also oil rich enough for the little birds that come and pick out the seeds. So they're just a small black sunflower shaped seed. But you don't get a whole tight cluster of huge seeds like that. But it's the same family, and sunflowers is a family more than just one kind of flower. I'm very interested in the way plant families are related to each other. I think it's very enlightening to see it and to start to recognize it, because when you recognize it in plants, you start to recognize it in all kinds of other things in life. It's like, how are things related? How
Yeah, which feeds off and feeds and
and
nourishes and
they learn different ways of, like, they adapt to different situations and change little things about themselves, and
hasn't all of life done that?
yeah, that's what happens.
One question: do the sunflowers need to be stratified?
Not the commercial ones that we eat. Absolutely not. No. You can just, but they do seem to come through the winter fairly well if they don't get eaten by birds, because we will often get volunteer sunflowers. They'll just come up where they fell, but usually they just get eaten by birds and squirrels and anything that finds them. So it's the lucky seed that gets missed.
You see it around here, the big sunflower head on the ground. The squirrel grabbed it,
And
ate his fill, left it.
So I'm again reminding people to save seeds and recognize different kinds of seeds for what their potential is to use.
Well, Trista,
Not just for growing, but also for using.
yes.
Seeds are good food.
Yeah.
They're good sprinkles on your cereal. They're good sprinkles on your baking.
Or cooking with it, yeah.
And they add
But Trista right now
flavors.
is doing hydroponic.
And we have
So
to learn
she got
more about that for next year or next week.
Sunflowers, or the sunflower seed, and he gets the sprouts, and they eat the sprouts.
Yep, you can
And
definitely.
she's got alfalfa. She's got
You know what's another really good thing to use for sprouts? All the seeds from broccoli, cabbage,
yes, she got broccoli going down
arugula, mustard, radish, any of those things, those seeds you can, even if you have way more of those seeds than you will ever use for your own gardening purposes, if you put all those seeds together, you can use them for sprouted greens in the winter, and they are really high in antioxidants, really rich in all
she's
kinds
got
of
about 4 of them
vitamins.
going down there now.
And they're
She's got
terrific.
she just rinses them out every couple of days.
So I guess
Flips it around. It's amazing.
the story is, please don't waste your seeds because they're really important.
No,
And
you
they
can
will
grow
keep
them.
you well.
Watermelon seeds, you can do stuff with.
Is there anything else I should be saying?
Say for the for the nut seed you mentioned, what kind of nut seed in say in Toronto or GTA area is easier for them to collect and
The easiest kind of nut to grow in the Toronto area is hazelnut. Because hazelnut, it's a more of a large shrub again than a real tree. They will be bearing from seed also in about 6-7 years. They're a very interesting plant because their pollination is interesting. They actually do their flowering really early in the season, like it's still winter. You know how witch hazel blooms in the winter? Well, other hazels seem to bloom in the winter too, although I don't think it's quite the same time. And they have catkins, which are the male flowers, and then they have the female flower, which receives sort of the way the larch or the other conifers have it, with the male sprinkling the pollen on the lower flowers, which are the female flowers. And hazelnuts come really fast. If you want to grow something like walnuts from seed, it's more like 30 years from seed, I think, for walnuts. I don't know, 20, 30, something like that. But there are also ways of growing nut trees from, they do a lot of grafting. Like they'll graft a nut or a fruit onto a root stock that's already established, and maybe a hardier root stock, and that way we got to do a whole thing on grafting. I think it's not really my specialty. We should get somebody who's a grafting specialist to explain that. I'm again not trying to encourage it too much because I like mostly from seed. But
would you like to describe what is grafting in a very simple?
Grafting?
Yeah, very basic, simple.
Yeah, well, grafting, very simply put, is kind of transplanting a piece of a plant onto another plant that will be its host plant. Sometimes you see those little ornamental cactuses, and people will graft a piece of a cactus onto another cactus. They often, all Macintosh apple trees, all delicious or russet or any named variety apple tree is a graft taken from the original seedling, and it has been cut up into a million pieces, and you make an incision into the bark and into the cambium of the host plant. And then there are different shapes of cuts that you can make in the wood, and then you tie the bare raw portions together so that they can grow together, and
We used
the
to do
graft
that.
can start taking.
You put a slice in the bark,
They start
and
to.
you'd wrap it with soil and let it go, and then it would grow
you
off.
tie them together really tight.
And you get an offshoot.
And usually you don't need to use any extra chemicals or anything, any dirt or anything like that. It's just a matter of uniting them and then letting them have time to
we used to do that with apple trees. We used to do it with pears.
Well, we have to learn more about grafting because it'd be fun to do some grafting, useful edible stalks onto ornamental trees. Oh, I found. Well, I guess I don't know where they are now, but anyway, I did find some beautiful little, really tasty crab apples they had growing on the island. I'm going to try to grow one of those from seed too, because it was tiny and it was delicious, like a really good fruit.
There's a question from the chat line that said, when you germinate your seed, how much light do you need?
Well, just to germinate, you don't need a lot of light. In fact, some seeds germinate better in the dark, but some seeds need some light exposure to germinate. But once they're germinated, then they need as much light as they're going to need as plants. So if they're, if it's something that needs to grow quickly and it needs a lot of light, you can run into real trouble if you don't have enough natural light. Some people use supplemental light. But anyway, about 14 hours a day of light is a sort of a minimum that plants need to grow well. And so they recommend that if you don't have 14 hours a day of good light, that you're using supplemental lighting. This is if they're indoors, of course. But if once things are outdoors, you don't need to provide any more than nature.
Say for the edible plant, which type of plant when they germinate need light and which type don't need light?
Well, there's none that don't need light at all. They just, like some seeds don't want to germinate, like they don't want to start. So those are the ones that are covered slightly, right? So they're in the dark while they're covered. So they do their germinating under the soil. But if it's the kind of seed that you press into the surface, you can just assume it will need some light. And you will see if they're getting enough light because they will grow much better with enough light. They really get tall and spindly and leggy and sometimes kind of yellowish if they don't have enough light.
So it's safe to say most of the edible plants in this area in Toronto, they need light to germinate?
Well, the thing with edible plants, the ones that we grow here grow fast, and they're kind of, they expect to grow fast, so they can only grow fast if they're getting enough of everything. And the more commercialized a plant is, it seems the more intolerant it is of having variations in its habits. Because in a wild population of plants, there's a greater variety of, they can put up with a bigger range of differences because some of them will adapt to the conditions, even if they're pretty bad, usually, for wild plants. Whereas sort of the usual crop plants, they want this much water, they want to be fertilized regularly, they don't want weeds around them. They're fussy, they're picky, they've been spoiled. So it sort of depends what the plant is. If it's a wild plant, it'll put up with almost anything within reason.
So you probably have to find out more information of the history of that seed.
Well, that particular kind of plant, yeah. You'll certainly find that sometimes you think that you've killed something, you've put a stone on top of it or a chair or whatever, and you pick that thing up like 2 weeks later and there are all these crumbled up little yellow weeds under there, and you think, oh, look what I've done, they're all miserable and they're all going to die. And then you've got them exposed to light, and in 3 days they've greened up and they're saying, you know, I'm ready to
I'm
go.
here.
Yeah, I survived your abuse.
Is there any plant that we should plant it in the fall and then let it go through the winter and then they will germinate in the spring?
Well, you should plant things in the fall. Garlic's got to go in the fall. Yeah, well, the thing is with things like nuts and perennial fruit bushes and trees, the fall is the time to start that.
Parsnip, parsley.
And if you want, you got to get Kyla to do a talk on cold frames.
Okay. So in the future episode, we will have some guests come to talk about how to grow things and let it through the winter, and then in the spring they will come out. And in the future show, we will have some detailed information about that process.
Yeah, and we're checking the garden every few days to see what's going to seed.
Talking with Kristen later?
Yep.
We got the straw. We just need the dirt now. And she's going to do a winter crop.
I think that will be very exciting.
Straw garden. We get the straw now. It was supposed to be here Saturday, but it just got here today. We haven't got the roots yet. But she's going to plant 6 by 6 by, so that you can reach over on each side.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But
and of course that straw just breaks down and becomes part of that soil.
Well, the straw, like asparagus is one comes to mind for me.
Oh yeah, perennial
strawberries.
Asparagus.
They grow very well in the straw. But strawberries you can't do now. I don't think you can do asparagus now. But
Well,
it's, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, she's going to have a cover over top of it,
Yeah.
so it'll act like a
So you can
greenhouse.
accelerate the season.
It'll
Yeah.
act like a greenhouse,
Yeah.
right? It'll keep the heat in. So I'm interested in seeing it.
Yeah, we should actually, when the weather improves, we should do a tour of what's going on around here so that people can see.
Well, she's going to start, like right now, I've just refurbished 2 of the 3 composters. I got the last one is, I'm just doing the lid now, that's all, and it is done. But I'm going to start up the first one. And then she brought up this thing with the composting. So, you know.
I'm just checking to see what's happening there.
So they are going to grow stuff into the straw bale.
Well, no, I don't think we can do that.
Okay.
I don't know what she's planning to put in there. But what they put earth down,
Okay.
then they put the straw on top,
Okay.
and then they cover it.
Okay.
So it acts like a
Can we see?
greenhouse.
I'm just sort of responding to what they're saying here. They
Is
can't.
he
They want to see
you.
who's talking.
Yeah,
to
yeah,
us.
yeah. So I show your face on.
Okay. Well, you can show everybody who's around here in space if you like.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's okay with them. Well, that should be.
So there's another guest we have today.
William.
Well, the gardener, right?
Yeah, it's the
No, handyman just.
gardeners in this area. So and this is the host today, Maria. So is any question folks like to ask in the chat line? Today we talk about the germination and other.
Have other questions come in from the previous ones that we've done that we haven't addressed?
One is about the tomato. So they want to know why the tomato seed need to be go through this process, put into a container for about a week.
Okay.
and then do the process after a week and so.
Okay, yeah.
What was the reason for that process?
The reason for that process is it's.
If we can
speeds-
recap the whole procedure and then explain why.
Yes, okay. We were talking about saving tomato seeds a couple of episodes ago, and one of the things that we discussed was the fact that the tomato interior should be rotten, and then you rinse off the rotten part after they've been sitting in the decay for about 3 or 4 days, and the good seeds sink to the bottom, and you pour off all the bad stuff and strain them out. Why do we do this? We do this for 2 reasons. Most seeds start out with a germination inhibitor around the seed, and in the case of tomatoes, it includes this sort of a gel that surrounds every tomato seed, and rotting gets rid of that gel, and it also seems to get rid of viruses that tend to follow tomatoes from year to year, which can actually really wipe out your tomatoes fairly early if it's one of those blights. We had a very dry year this year, so we didn't have a lot of tomato blight that I saw, but tomatoes, if they're growing in a damp climate, for instance in BC, I hear that people grow their tomatoes under canopies so that they are not wet because of the frequent rains, and those viruses will overwinter on the seed if you do not decay the seed, the pulp of the plant to get that gel off the seeds. So it does 2 things.
So one of the purposes is to remove that gel, which will kind of prevent the seed from germination.
It slows the germination by a couple of weeks, yeah. And if you have a seed that's been put through that process, it usually comes up in 3 or 4 days. Now, sometimes you may already have a rotten tomato, and everything in that interior may already be rotten, and you probably don't have to put that through that. I've got a really squishy one at home, so.
Well, I have one here. I've got about 4 of them.
Is there any other edible plant that have this kind of property of this kind of gel that's surrounding the seed?
Well, to varying degrees. Things like ground cherries and tomatillos have some of that. So I would treat them the same way.
Okay.
Sometimes they just dry in the husk.
A lot of squash. One around it.
Well, yes, it's a little bit of a sliminess around them, but it's more, I think, like a placenta that the squash seeds are in.
Watermelon.
Usually I just dry those melons. I haven't done that. But with tomatoes, also tomatoes are very susceptible to viruses, more so than most other plants, I think, partly because we grow a lot of tomatoes almost everywhere. It's an easy to grow plant, but then because there's more of it. Like sweet potatoes, for instance, there don't seem to be any sweet potato diseases that we get up here. We can grow sweet potatoes here very nicely if they get enough sun, and they don't get bugs, and they don't get mold or mildew or viruses. They just look wonderful. Now, I suspect in places where they grow sweet potatoes a lot, you probably find more sweet potato diseases.
Like it says American.
Yeah, I think because once there's a thing that knows it's there, it'll be there with it. But if we're growing something on almost complete isolation up here from the usual population, I think that keeps them.
Last week you showed us the sweet potato in several 2 or 3 containers, small containers.
Yeah, I had.
It's usually if they don't grow in the soil, grow in the containers. Usually they grow in that way, 2 or 3 containers to hold the sweet potatoes and.
Well, they do the same thing that the tomatoes do. They root from the nodes. So they'll creep along and they'll root from the nodes, and then each node has the potential to grow actual tubers under where the node roots. Now, also, one thing I didn't mention, I think, when we talked about sweet potatoes, is sweet potatoes do bloom I've only seen it a couple of times because they seem to need a really long season before they bloom. And the flowers look like morning glory flowers. And you will see from the way it grows that you can see the relationship between morning glories and sweet potatoes if you just look at the form of the plant and the form of the flowers.
Well,
I'd love seeds from
the morning
sweet
glory.
potatoes.
Remember my garden? They said it grows
Morning glories are beautiful, but if we can
Eight
get
up
seeds
north,
from
North and young, they grow them.
yeah,
Up
well,
the light standard, they actually grow them.
They-
It's like
they're very
beautiful.
beautiful. But the important thing I'm looking for is seeds, and not morning glory seeds, because we have tons of those, but sweet potato seeds. And also, what do they cross with? Do they cross with morning glories? Do different kinds of sweet potatoes cross with each other?
Or
I
the
suspect they do.
sweet pea is the same kind of family. Yeah, they still grow. They put out
Well,
the big
they're
blossom.
they're
they
no
got
they're
the
they're they're,
vine.
they're legumes. Those are
Yeah,
legumes.
but still, it looks cool.
Well, I'm not going to say anything because I think that's maybe not.
There's a question from the chat line say that are seeds best stored in plastic Ziploc or paper bag? Where's the best way to store them in?
Paper bags store the seeds in paper bags until they are bone dry, and then it's better to store them in something that is closed up. Now, I don't recommend Ziploc bags so much simply because they can be bitten through by either mice or sometimes little caterpillars, little moths and things will find their way into seeds. I really recommend, once they're dry, to put them in jars. And just make sure that you don't leave those jars in bright sunlight. Don't leave them in, actually they should be in the dark.
Okay, now I have a question. How long do seeds last?
One thing that people are wondering about is how long do seeds last, and the seeds vary in how long they last. Onion seeds only last about 2 years. Lettuce seeds might be 3 or 4 years.
But you're looking at least a year.
Tomato, well, it has to last until the next season. Some things will be just fine after 5 or 6 years. And I've grown tomatoes quite successfully from seeds that were 11, 12 years old.
Okay.
Because I get some very old seeds through the seed exchange that I don't really believe have any life left in them, and then
Now does
they
heat
come up.
affect it?
Does what?
Heat.
Heat. Yes, you want to keep them cool.
Okay, so if you say in the house there, in the greenhouse, they wouldn't last.
It's better to keep, well, seeds, if they're in the fridge, actually, that's terrific. Or if they're bone dry, you can keep them in the freezer. Before you take your bottle of seeds, your jar, out of the fridge, it's a good idea to before you open it, it's a good idea to let it come to room temperature before you open it, so there's no condensation forming in there. I use actually a lot of little plastic vitamin bottles and medicine bottles.
Yeah, the little pill.
Yeah, because usually you don't have
You don't have that first amount.
you don't need a huge jar for, the odd time I'll get enough seeds to fill something like this up. But usually I just get, tiny amount. And some seeds are so small that you just sort of let them, you just don't need that to take up that much space in your house, because if you have a whole lot of seeds, it takes up a lot of room, just like any collection of anything else. So cool and dark and dry. It's important too. The drier the seeds are kept, the longer they'll last. And if you freeze your seeds, which you can do once they're really dry, you should be able to keep them for years.
How about the grains?
Grains? Well, I don't know much about the keeping qualities of grains, although I suspect they're quite good for several years, because people have traditionally stored grain for long periods of time. one kind of grain, it's not exactly a grain, but it's used as a grain the way amaranth and quinoa are used as grains. Teff, which comes from Ethiopia, and I believe teff seeds are good for decades if they're dry.
And the corns?
Corn is not that viable after about the first 3 years. It's pretty much tired after 3 years. I don't know if the old varieties of corn are the same, but the varieties we have now, the commercially adopted varieties only seem to last about 3 years, and then the germination really falls away.
So I saw some of the corns of many colors at the same.
Yes, the Indian corn.
So they have all kind of colors in one unit, and some are kind of close to the deep purple.
Yeah.
I think they're more close to the native.
Yeah.
Well, the native North Americans, and I guess native South Americans too, and Central Americans, used to grow many different kinds of corn, because corn has different uses depending on what kind it is. So they already had developed corn long before Europeans came to North America. And some of it is good for flour, so that would be like a flint corn. And some of it is good for popping, which is wonderful, and some of it is just good for fresh eating. So if you want things like the corn, the pollen from the corn is the male, as usual, and when those tassels are forming, that's how the pollen is being scattered from the corn tassels. And oh no, just a second. The pollen is scattered from the top of the corn, from that thing that grows on top, and it lands on the tassels, which are the stigmas. I'm sorry, there's a lot of plant biology here. So the tassels of the corn are actually the female part that have this conduit that receives the pollen. The pollen makes a long trip down that conduit, or at least the little leg that it puts out to fertilize that. But each kernel on a corn, each kernel can potentially have a different father. Now we're assuming, because these are all the same color and shape and size and everything, it's probably just the same father for all of it. But if you get corn where it's white and blue and red and everything, then each of those might actually be like a litter of kittens, where you get, all different colors of kittens, all different colors of corn, different heritage in each little individual kernel. And this was a terrible year for corn in Ontario and in North America. A terrible year for corn. And of course, we'll have to watch out that we don't get our corn contaminated by the airborne Monsanto corn.
It seems the getting more and more genetic crops grow here as a urban grower. How can we prevent our crops from contaminated from the GMO crop, or the pollens from the GMO crop?
Well, some people can cover to prevent cross-pollination of corn in any way. One thing you can do is put a paper bag over the developing cob, and just uncover it when the desired pollen is available. So when that plant is producing pollen, if you want it to be self-fertile, usually you grow corn in a stand of a few dozen at least, if you can. In a field, of course, they grow hundreds and hundreds of corn plants all together. But if they're all the same kind, you will have a genetically similar outcome, because it'll be all the same pollen from the same variety. But if there's anything airborne at the same time that you're that your stigmas are receptive, that your silks are receptive, then they are just as likely to do the pollinating as the one that you want. So that's why they cover them with paper bags, and it does seem to help. But it's very intensive because most farmers don't really want to go into the field to cover things with paper bags and uncover them, and also actually the paper bag has another good use though. It does keep the insects off, and birds might be confused by it because they may not realize there's goodies in the paper bag. So you may have better chance of actually getting a harvest.
So for the gardener or small scale corn grower, they can use the paper bag to prevent the contamination from the other GMO corn.
To some extent, yeah. But I still think because this stuff is airborne, you never know where it is. And it's microscopic, so you really never know where it is.
At this point in time, is there which kind of crop is the farmers go in large scale for the GMO variety in Canada?
Which kind of things are grown with genetic modification now in Canada?
In large scale.
Corn and soy are probably the two biggest ones.
Canola.
And canola, yeah. Canola for the oil seed. And canola apparently they've got all these excuses about why canola it's okay to genetically modify it, because they say, well, there was no real canola before it was genetically modified. Well, it's actually not true. There is organic canola, but it's kind of losing battle. I don't know if anybody has been trying to grow it very much lately. I think it's probably easier to... Is anybody out there growing organic, non-GMO canola? We want to know.
If anyone knows that the farmers here still growing the non-GMO canola, say in the Paris, they can give us some info.
Yeah, we'd love to know who's growing real non-GMO anything actually. Sweet potatoes are being grown genetically modified in Africa. Mangoes are often genetically modified now. Is it mangoes or is it papayas?
No, papayas.
Papayas are genetically modified now. Okay, I knew it was one of those, yeah.
They're starting to play around with the mango.
They are playing around with the mango.
Okay. You have the Mexican mango, and they want it kind of, it's like kiwi.
Well, if the thing is, if all they do is hybridize, I don't care. Hybridizing is fine. It's not.
Yeah, but they try and alter it. They try and make it better.
No, that's the part that.
And that's like in the University of Guelph. I can't remember the name of the university, but in Guelph, they're growing a kiwi with no skin. Like no hair.
Yeah, but there's
a smooth skin kiwi.
That's a hardy northern kiwi. I don't think it's genetically modified. I think that's the way it is. Well, they may be playing with it now, but it wasn't played with before.
Kiwis always had the fiber.
Well, there's different.
Now they're trying to make it where there's no fiber.
But there are.
Smooth skin.
But some of that happens naturally. It's just like you can get yellow tomatoes and orange tomatoes and
black.
You could do that with genetic modification, but you don't need to, because all these varieties really exist. And what we need to do is preserve those. So I don't know, I have to find out more about that kiwi. But I know that the northern kiwi is a non-fuzzy little fruit, and it's just much smaller than a commercial kiwi.
Because in the GMO process, they slice the gene from different species into that particular species they want to genetically modify. So they introduce the gene from a different species into this host species. It's a very different story from we try to develop some different variety of the same species.
Yeah.
They develop different variety, but it's within the same species. They don't mix up with the genes with other species. But the GMO, they mixing up the gene from other species and you introduce some other element into it. So it's a very different.
Well, the irony is there's so many things that are being lost that exist now, and because they're natural, nobody can make a profit from controlling them, because if it just exists, then we can all use it. So the important reason to save your seeds is at least you can control what you can save and share that with your community, because as more and more GM products are becoming available, and I really feel that it's being shoved down people's throats just to make money. We can't escape it, and we never voted on this. We never gave permission. Nobody ever asked us. It was just thrust upon us. I think it's a kind of rape.
More shameful is when the consumer asks the government to put a regulation or legislation, ask the producer to label their products or produce have any GMO content. The government refused to do it. I will ask them if there's nothing to hide, why they don't tell us what is in it.
I bet the cat's out of the bag already. They couldn't even guarantee it at this point, I think, that it wasn't. You know, like we can say, well, we don't want GM, but if the producer, first of all, they think that we're not going to want it if it's labeled that way, so they're fooling us. But I think also that nowadays, no matter how you label it, you're never really sure what got into there. You know?
But even in Europe, they are labeling whether there's a GMO content.
Well, yeah. Oh no, I agree, and I believe that we need to label things, but I think you also need to put an apology under the label when you say whatever it is, saying, considering what was unleashed on our fields between last year and this year, it may be a totally different story by the time it gets to your plate.
Yeah.
Like 2 kinds of sweet corn that were GM were introduced in Ontario this year, apparently.
In Ontario?
Yeah.
So they have the GMO sweet corn?
Apparently.
Oh.
And there's no way to know. You go to Loblaws and you buy sweet corn, and maybe it's GM and maybe it isn't. Who knows?
So some people always emphasize of the choice, the right to have a different choice. Why the consumer don't have the choice to select the GMO-free or not GMO-free produce. They should have at least the information available to them to label it, whether this produce or products or food have any GMO content. It's the very basic demand that we should have the information for us to make a decision whether we can choose to eat the GMO or we choose not to eat the GMO. We need that basic information as a label in the produce.
And the thing is, if you do that, if you know what you're getting, you can still decide whether or not to eat it. But even though if the GM exists out there, you can't decide which bee is going to go to which plant. You know, we can't regulate the way creatures behave. So even with all the controls, I mean, the problem with this is really it's escaped. It's already escaped. And it's been out there for a long time already, and it just snuck up on us. Well, with some things like tomatoes, I know they're trying to they have genetically modified some tomatoes, but tomatoes don't cross out as easily. Like, they're not wind pollinated, and they are usually self-fertile, so you can probably control it a little better than you could with things that just poof and it's gone.
Yeah. If you put this kind of demand or restriction, more and more plants will be put into kind of GMO type of plant, and then more and more of those pollen will be go out into the air, and the contamination will be more serious. It is kind of a battle we have to wage to stop this kind of proliferation of those GMO crops. Otherwise, every plant species will become GMO if they choose to develop the GMO variety. And we are losing to every species of plant edible.
We are, and with urban agricultural, actually, we have a little more leeway with controlling these things, because in the countryside where there are huge farms planted, and you go by a field of corn in the country or a field of soybeans, you don't know what kind it is. There's no label that says, you know, GM or not GM. But if you're in the city, things aren't grown in such large quantities here, and they're not grown with as much commercial intent, although that's probably coming as urban agriculture expands. And I'm kind of looking forward to growing more stuff in the city. But I think we need some kind of a manifesto for urban agriculture, that it'll be a totally non-GM enterprise.
We should not encourage any GMO variety go in the urban area.
Exactly, because we live here and we say so.
Yep. So, folks, if any other question you like to ask in the chat line, feel free to raise any question, and we try to answer as much as we can. And for this week, the shows kind of, for some reason, bump up a day. And we may try to rebroadcast it tomorrow, Wednesday afternoon. If we cannot, you can check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/openfoods. That's OPENFOODS. We also have a blog. The address of the blog is openfoods.blogspot.ca. Openfoods, OPENFOODS.blogspot.ca. So you can check out those two sites, and we have the footage uploaded to the YouTube channel, and you can get the address at the blog site of the Open Foods. If we don't have any other questions from the chat line, then we will sign off for now for this week, and see you next Wednesday afternoon. Bye for now.